All right, fellas. So forgive me for not shaving and not cutting my hair. I got this mixture of Wolverine and Donald Trump going on. But I got a message on Discord asking about the Cutlass Steel. So I'm just gonna go over my thoughts of it real quick. Be a pretty short video, hopefully. But essentially, people are asked why you would get a Cutlass Steel over other ships. Basically, what I'm looking at is the Cutlass Steel is I'm split first off on getting a Cutlass Steel. I think two Valkyries is what I'm going to aim for, but until then, I would probably get a couple of Cutlass Steels in an entry level vehicle, especially starting off in the game. First off, I think Drake, as a ship manufacturer, is probably going to be willing to sell vehicles, especially these cheaper vehicles, to starting civilians, or whatever else in the system. So they're probably going to be easier to earn or get in game when the game first comes out, which is a plus. As for like the real world equivalent, to me, the Cutlass is kind of like an Osprey, I guess, for the U.S. military. Able to carry like 25 people, able to carry some cargo, but mostly, I think the Cutlass is um, a generalist ship. I think it's like yeah, just a general purpose, like master of a few things kind of ship, not like a master drop ship. Because the more I think about it, like it doesn't transport ground vehicles and stuff, but you could still technically put cargo on it. You got two walking paths and the back. You could put some cargo in there. You can put some cargo in the front if you really want to. I don't know if the armor is necessarily better than the base version, but the firepower is. So when you're looking at getting a Cutlass Steel, really it comes down to kind of what kind of player you are, and do you plan on having, it as a drop ship fully crewed all the time. So for instance, the Valkyrie as a solo pilot, you have like one man turret underneath the bottom, you have no missiles, and you need like four people to crew the other main turret armaments on the ship. When it comes to the Cutlass Steel, one solo pilot can still man pretty much all the main guns and everything else that you need in the ship. So you really got that benefit of being able to deal with any threats that you want, do bounty missions, things like that. And I believe you get extra missiles. It's either you get one you get bespoke racks of missiles or you get extra missiles. It might be both, but I think they're size 3 missiles. So in that case, you're looking at quite a few size 3 missiles, which would be able to deal with size 2 anti-ground vehicles, which the Valkyrie just won't have the ability to deal with missiles like that. They won't be able to just shoot missiles and take out ground targets. So the Cutlass Steel, it feels like you'd be able to use those missiles to take out like cyclones and storms and stuff, but you would still have to worry about ballistas and things like that that have longer missile ranges than you. You also got a lot more turret gun coverage on the side, so you get a lot more total guns in general with the Cutlass Steel, but you don't have as much protection as you do with the Valkyrie because the Valkyrie has remote turrets. The turrets are at an angle, so you only got like a limited amount of space that somebody can shoot you through the doorway. Cutlass Steel, you got a lot of open space for people to shoot out of. You got two turrets on each door. So you are bringing a lot of firepower to a battle, but even as like a general use ship with a crew of three, you're actually giving your co-pilot something to do if you want to go for combat because you're not necessarily caring about a tractor beam in the back of your ship anymore. You have a turret on the back of your ship, and I think it might be a size 3. And if it is a size 3, you know, technically you have the size 3 back turret and the upper turret. So you have almost most of your firepower shooting backwards as you do forwards, because forward facing you would have four size 3 guns and the top turret, I believe. Backside you're going to have two size 3s and a top turret, which is perfectly fine. It's going to be enough to deal with like light fighters and stuff like that, I would assume. And then if you really wanted to get frisky with it, you have the turrets on the inside. So you have your back turret size 1, And just for reference, the Arrow top turret right now has two size 1 guns on it. So although it might not be the best weapon in the world, it isn't the worst either. But really, it comes down to cost effectiveness when you want to use something. Would I like to have two Valkyries? Yes. I think I would probably prefer that. But the difference is if you have one Valkyrie, for the most part, as far as I can read online and have seen, the Cutlass is shorter because it doesn't have that extra cargo space in the back. And even the base Cutlass, okay, so let's say the Valkyrie itself, 20 people that you could carry on there and a couple of ground vehicles. We've seen with the Valacar and stuff coming out, the ground vehicles would be important. But even a Cutlass Black, you could technically, as far as I can see, fit two Cutlasses in the same footprint of a Valkyrie for the most part. Let's say on the Kraken, for example, one of those medium pads, you put the Valkyrie on it, but the Cutlass is a little bit shorter or a little bit less wide and then a little bit shorter than the Valkyrie. So if you turned it sideways, technically it would be able to fit two in the same footprint. So if the Valkyrie can fit on there, you could put, you know, 2 to 4 Cutlasses potentially. But if you have two Valkyries and one gets shot down, you lose that Valkyrie. If you have a Valkyrie and two Cutlasses, you have a spare, and then you have another ship that you can bring in before you even have the risk of the Valkyrie. So as a general use ship, I think it's perfectly fine to have Cutlass Steels on board. And you also got to think Valkyrie with it's like 20 troops and then a vehicle, so you can fit like 25 to 30 troops or whatever on the Valkyrie and drop them off potentially. More if you wanted to not have seats. But a Cutlass Steel is 18, and then you have two beds. So you have 18 seats, two beds, so you're looking at 20 potentially there. Then you have 5 door gunners potentially. So if you flew with the doors open or whatever, you're looking at like 25 people, which is respectable. It's a good amount. But then when you put two Cutlass Steels in the same footprint of a Valkyrie, you're looking at 50 people that you could drop off with those two ships. So it really comes down to if you need to move massive amounts of troops, let's say, and you don't need to really risk putting them in a war zone in the middle, Cutlass Steel is probably a good option, but the Valkyrie will be able to give you a lot of utility when it comes to ground vehicles. So if you have two Valkyries, you're looking, you could potentially drop 60 people off or something in two ground vehicles, which is a good amount. But if you have a Valkyrie and then two Cutlasses, you could potentially drop off 70 to 80 people and a ground vehicle. So is it worth the extra amount of effort that it takes to have two Valkyries? I'm not 100% sold on it. Unless you need to move a lot of ground vehicles very quickly or deploy multiple ground vehicles over and over, which I do think is the end goal. But when it comes to starting out in the game, I think the Cutlass Steel is potentially just a better option because, even though you can't move the ground vehicles, you have plenty of firepower for bounty missions and other ground FPS missions. You have plenty of seats to have people help you if you happen to have like a bigger org that you want to deal with. And you have a lot of firepower to deal with like mercenary missions, animals and stuff that are on the ground. There's a lot of things that you could potentially do there, as well as get extra fire support for your fleet or your troops, because you don't have to have it full of people all the time. You don't have to have 18 people in there. You could run that ship if you wanted to arm every single gun for some reason. What would it be, 5? You'd have 8 people on there. And also technically, I would say I don't know if it makes sense or not, but if there is supposed to be 18 people in that Cutlass Black, does it get extra life support? Because that would be an interesting thing to know as well. Because if you're supposed to be having life support for like 20 plus people on your ship, that would be a big improvement over like a Cutlass Black, kind of. Just when it comes to like the amount of people that you could stick on there. But the fact that you can still put, 1 SU boxes and stuff in there if you wanted to, I think that's potentially a lot of utility for beginning box missions, beginning bounty missions, maybe like troop transport missions if that's ever a thing. Ground targets. You also have all of those weapons racks in there to store weapons. And, even though that you don't have necessarily all of the storage capacity. So when it comes to like fighting ground missions, I think the Cutlass Steel is a good option, and the fact that you can get multiple of them is a good option as well. And especially when the game first comes out, you probably won't know exactly what you're doing, so you won't know what situations not to bring a Valkyrie into. But if you have a Cutlass Steel go down and you're able to fit two in the same footprint, you'll have a backup to come and pick you up afterwards. And the cost ratio is also like it's like $200 or something for a Cutlass Steel. It's like 400 something dollars for a Valkyrie. So you can pretty much buy two with the same amount of money anyway. And you also got to think if you have two Cutlass Steels, and let's say that you crew it up just for the guns or whatever. So you have two Cutlass Steels, same cost as a Valkyrie. You have 16 people, which would be about the same as a base standard Valkyrie. You would have forward facing six. You'd have 12 size 3 guns. Backwards facing, you would have 8 size 3 guns. And then either side, you could have 4, like 2 to 4 size 1 guns. So as a group running two Cutlass Steels, it gives you a lot more spread out firepower. Whereas like the Valkyrie has let's just think if we use them as a group. You send in two Valkyries. Yes, they could have a bunch of people on board, but when it comes to the firepower, you have the bottom turret, and then you have a secondary turret, and you have an upper turret, so you could potentially have that, and then you have a size 4 wing gun. So from a side angle, you're going to have 5 guns. So with two Valkyries, you could potentially have 10 guns sideways. And then with Cutlass Steel, forward facing, you would have way more firepower. You still have missiles to deal with anti-ground targets while you're coming in, or deal with like tanks or anything like that without having to like sit there and try to manually shoot them for a while. And then you're gonna have, well, top turret. You wouldn't have as much sideways firepower, but if you have all the turrets manned on the bottom, you would have more total AoE coverage for ground targets. Because the Valkyrie, you would have side guns, bottom turret, internal turret, basically. Similar firepower, maybe a little bit more than one Cutlass. But with two Cutlasses, you're going to have way more soldiers you can put down on the ground. So ideally, I think what you would do is probably, let's say a ground assault fleet. When you first start off, Valkyrie, two Redeemers, and then you would have two Cutlass Steels. Then the Cutlass Steels could provide AoE cover fire with the Valkyrie or with the Redeemers, while the Valkyrie lands and unloads like the medical Ursa, because you'd probably need a medical Ursa or something on the ground. And then the Valkyrie would come up and provide cover while the other two ships landed. Or you could land those two Cutlasses on the edges of the battle, unload troops there, and book out while the Valkyrie's in the middle taking a lot of fire, and then the Redeemers are providing cover. I think it really just comes down to, do you want to move more troops or do you want to move more vehicles? And for the maximum amount of troops, you can't really beat Cutlass Steels, even with the Valkyrie, because there's 2 of them per each Valkyrie. So you're gonna have a lot of feet on the ground, like just infantry. Valkyrie it's gonna be, God, you just think about the comparison. If you go into a battle, can a Cutlass Steel beat a Valkyrie in a fight? Probably. And it doesn't need as many turret gunners. So you're looking at multiple size 3s, and size 3 missiles, and 2 cutlasses to each Valkyrie. So if you have 2 Valkyries coming in, you would have 4 cutlass steels, which is like, what, 48 size 3 missiles or something, and a ton of turret power that's pilot controlled, or a lot of gun power that's pilot controlled. You might lose a little bit of your ground coverage, but I mean, just looking at the numbers as well, you're looking at like 25 people per cutlass, so you're looking at 100 people that you could set on the ground. Valkyries, you'd be able to put, what, 40, 50? So like half as many people on the ground, but you could drop a ground vehicle. So I guess it really just matters what your game plan is for the most part. Because 100 people on the ground, I mean, that's a lot of people, but you also got a lot of firepower in those ships just pilot controlled. So even when you don't have a crew, it's still a cutlass. Whereas like if you don't have a crew in the Valkyrie, you have 2 size 3 turrets. So even when you drop 100 people on the ground with 4 cutlass steels, you still have 4 cutlass pilots able to support you, fight off air attacks, fight off fighters, fight off redeemers. They might not be the strongest, but that's still a lot of flexibility to have in a fleet compared to just unloading a Valkyrie. So I think there's still a lot of utility in a cutlass steel. I think it's still a valuable piece of equipment to have. My only thing is I wouldn't trust the cutlass steel to drop or pick up people in the middle of a hot zone like I would a Valkyrie. So in my mind, especially when starting out in the game, having 1 Valkyrie is perfectly fine for me. It's enough to drop, a support vehicle and a good amount of people down, and it's enough to carry supplies. Until you get a ground force with a lot of ground vehicles or anything like that, I don't think necessarily the Valkyrie is that needed. Because the main benefit the Valkyrie would have is like picking up Ursa rovers and cyclones and stuff, bringing them back to a base to repair, or potentially if you have like ballistas, loading up torpedoes and missiles, sending them over there and manually loading your ground vehicles. So I think the Valkyrie becomes more of a support ship for ground vehicles and also, ground troop transports. The missiles being the primary factor, being able to go and load, like bring size 2 missiles and stuff over to like cyclones or storm tanks or anything else, I think is vital. But you could still technically put those things on a cutlass steel. It just wouldn't have a cargo grid. So you got that toss up there. But especially starting off, just having the ability to move troops around is going to be very good. And you don't need to put all of your vehicles in the middle of a combat zone. So I could easily see Cutlass Steels placing, 20 plus people on the edges of a mission site and then flying off or going and providing cover fire for something. And then you just keep your Valkyrie back. And if things get too bad, you bring the Valkyrie in and you set it down right in the middle of the fight while the Cutlasses can provide support. So I'm not opposed to any of that. I think it's probably a pretty good idea to have some things like that. Having some sort of main pilot control. So it's going to be more like an Osprey slash like helicopter coming in, kind of like an attack helicopter that's able to pick troops up. And I'm fine with that. I think that's a pretty good, utility to have in a fleet. Being able to know, like, hey, we got people that need a ride or whatever. We don't have enough people to crew our Valkyrie right now. We only have like 1 pilot. Just hop in the Cutlass Steel. You know, they hop in there. They have plenty of firepower to deal with most things they're probably going to run into, and they're going to be able to get the job done and move the troops. So I wouldn't frown on the Cutlass Steel. I wouldn't steer fully away from it. I think it's a very good ship in general. Like for the price point and for what it can do, I think it's going to be fine. But if you don't really care about moving a bunch of troops around or anything like that, just get like a Cutlass Black because you're going to have the ability still. And when you get like 2 Cutlass Steels versus 2 Cutlass Blacks, if both Cutlass Blacks are running together, you can still drop off like 12 to 14 people. So for like a very small org starting off, Cutlass Black is going to have plenty of seats for you, plenty of cargo, still a decent amount of firepower, even though you don't have the side door turrets. So I wouldn't frown on the Cutlass Black, but once you get to a bigger organization, if you're going to have a whole bunch of people and you need to, and you know you're going to focus on ground tactics and ground assaults, um, Cutlass Steel does offer a lot of utility when it comes to just the amount of boots that you can put on the ground, the amount of people that you can transport. So I'm gonna hop off. I gotta go. Y'all guys have a good one. And if you have any more questions, just send me a